Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our April 13th Land Use Committee meeting. I'd like to just start by letting everyone know, because I know there's a few questions that have come up this morning regarding the staff who is looking at the city-owned properties. We do not have that report back yet, so we won't actually be discussing that this morning until we have the report back, and I will make sure as soon as we have that report back that it is posted to the city website. But at some future meeting, we will discuss that as soon as we have the report back from city staff. Also, for just to update the members that may or may not know, the City Council did have a work session on the ADU law that ordinance that we worked on, and that is being put forward to the City Council for second reading on this coming Monday's meeting on April 17th, in case anyone's interested. Legal has reviewed it, and there will be a few adjustments based off of their review of it and whether or not we actually match or are in line to the state statute. With that said, did I miss anything? I don't think so in our announcements. I'd like to start our agenda, and I believe Nick has something to go forward. I was asked if we could take a look at a short-term solution. I know all of us have discussed how our incentives in the downtown area, mostly in our character districts, the incentive of either workforce housing or community space had not been very effective. We've gotten community space all the time. We haven't gotten any workforce housing, and that community space hasn't really been to the level of what I think was intended when it was written. So I was asked if we could possibly just remove that. So with that in mind, I will let Nick, who has started to look at this already, walk us through what he has for us.
By the seat of my pants.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've handed out to each of you a 4-page document, the first being the cover page, which is merely intended to be the beginning of a longer conversation about the agenda item that was just introduced. We've not spent a lot of time talking about exactly what the City Council or this committee is looking to do, so I took a stab myself at answering the question of, should we make adjustments to the incentives, the development incentives in the greater downtown, which includes the West End, the character-based zoning districts, to maybe reorder or prioritize workforce housing at a stronger position than it currently is in the code and has been since 2016-17 when we adopted the North End and then the West End. So I did a presentation 2 years ago at the City Council, because this was a topic with the last City Council about the incentives and whether the community space was whether we were getting a good deal, and whether it was a fair trade, and whether it was equitable, and whether it was the right thing to be doing along the North Mill Pond, Foundry Place, throughout the downtown. So the one thing, I do have that presentation here if we need it for discussion purposes, because I think what's really challenging for a lot of people in Portsmouth, and it's reasonable, is the community space that is negotiated at the planning board level for any of these particular projects is largely not yet on the ground. So people can't actually see the benefits. And if you go to the brick market, regardless of what you think of the architecture of the building, if you look at the community space that accompanied that project, which includes all those alleys, which I think a lot of people assume maybe had public access, but they were all privately owned. They all could have been gated. And bar public access out to Penn Hollow, to Daniel, to Pleasant Street. I think a lot of us feel like they were really successful in their transition to, high quality pedestrian space. They're not quite finished, but that's an example of something that's now completed or near completed. But there are many of these projects, particularly in the North End along the Mill Pond, that haven't done anything yet because it's more complicated to do so because of permitting and design considerations of going along the edge or in the buffer zone along the North Mill Pond. So that presentation I did 2 years ago outlined examples of things to come, which I think 5-10 years from now, when people see them, they'll be like, wow, that's fantastic. But we're not there yet. You can't see them. And all the properties that we're talking about are privately owned properties. They aren't city-owned properties. So we don't have any inherent rights to use any of these properties if we don't use this innovative land use statute to effectively trade increased density for public amenities. So that's sort of a high-level introduction to the whole community space, workforce housing conversation and the options available in the current code. If you look at the character districts in the overlay, which are essentially along the North Mill Pond in the west end and the north end, there are three density bonus provisions in the character-based zoning that have been on the books for the better part of 6 or 7 years. And the first one relates to building footprints, and it's not the first one that was adopted, it's probably the second, but it's the first one you run into chronologically reading the code. And this was used by the AC Hotel, and this was used, well, the AC Hotel is a good example. It has at-grade parking on the ground, and has a liner building along the street. So there's access to the parking, but no parking in the first 24 feet of the building as required under the ordinance. What did they get for that ability to put the parking on the ground floor and have that second level with the donut hole, kind of the C-shaped building where there is parking on 2 levels? They got a bigger footprint. They were allowed to make the footprint of the building larger than the underlying zoning allowed. They did not get a bonus. They were eligible for one, but they didn't take it. And when we wrote the code, we didn't appreciate the financial implications of a 6th story, which was allowed in that property under the charrette process and the zoning that's in place. You can't really do the podium construction over 5 floors, and the podium is the concrete base with the stick frame or metal frame construction above the first floor. So it would have been concrete and steel to get to 6 floors, and the economics prevented them from even being interested in doing that. So they did a bigger footprint. They didn't do a taller building. As a result, they used option 1 here, which required them to have, I think it was 30% community space, which they provided. And it's behind the 3S Art Space, and they actually provided much more than that and used, I don't want to complicate the conversation, but we do have a transfer development rights provision in this code as well, which allows you to land bank extra land that you're not required to give the city as part of the trade. You can bank it, and then you can either use it somewhere else in the district or sell it to somebody else in the district. So that one property, the AC Hotel, had a ½ acre of open space that went out along the North Mill Pond, and they only needed about 2/3 of that to meet their obligations under this code for the parking. So the other third they banked in round numbers. So that's option 1. Option 2 is the incentive overlay districts, the 2 areas, the north end and the west end, that are shown on the zoning map. And if you're in an overlay district, which would be, Green Street, Rains Ave, Foundry Place, little parts of it, all the way out to Heineman, actually, on Foundry Place, folks that own property there can get an extra story or a bigger footprint if they provide a certain amount of community space, or in their case, workforce housing. It's an option. You do one or the other. And there are 2 disincentives to doing, at least 2, workforce housing instead of community space. The first is you often need a conditional use permit to do the workforce housing because of the requirements. I think it's largely based on the state requirements that you can't mandate it. So it's a conditional use permit. It's an innovative land use statute that requires somebody to do it in a trade situation. So that we don't have that same condition with the community space. That's essentially, you get a taller building, you give us the community space, you don't need a conditional use permit. So that can act as a disincentive to doing the second choice, which is workforce housing. The second is we probably have most of the numbers, the numeric quantities of the workforce housing and the degree of affordability of that workforce housing. We probably have those numbers wrong. And we probably have them wrong because we never did a deep dive on the market analysis and the submarkets that exist in Portsmouth to understand how the economics work from Market Square to the north end to the west end to Lafayette, if we're talking about the gateway districts where workforce housing is also allowed. If we don't calibrate the numbers we put in the code with the market, we're likely to miss the mark. And I think the evidence is suggested after 7 years in not generating one workforce housing unit in downtown or the West End outside of the West End yards, which is not in the overlay district, it's in the gateway, we haven't produced any workforce housing via the zoning since 2017 in the character-based districts. So something's not working. And, some people think it's the disincentive, some people think it's the math. It's probably a bit of both, and probably some other factors. The real estate market is obviously extremely tight within a quarter mile or an eighth of a mile of Market Square, and changes dramatically each eighth of a mile you move away from Market Square. So the good news on that is we are discussing with a firm, a financial analyst firm, doing an analysis, a market-based analysis and looking at our code and looking at the market conditions in Portsmouth in these respective submarkets to attempt to calibrate the code so it generates and produces workforce housing where we'd like to see it. So that's not in this presentation. We haven't hired that firm. All I'm attempting to do today is sort of highlight the issues as at least we see them and start a conversation. So the third and last bucket here for density bonus provisions is it relates to properties over 1 acre in size. These are already in the code, if it isn't clear, these three. If you have a property that's more than 1 acre in area, you can get an additional story, and you're not in an overlay district, and you're not trying to put necessarily parking underneath the building. You can use this third bucket, which is written for properties over 1 acre. And I think loosely you could look at the Portsmouth Housing Authority and the property they did on Court Street. That there's an extra story there from what the underlying zoning allowed. That property was more than 1 acre in total. Mark McNabb's property at 60 Penn Hollow also qualified for this to get a larger. He didn't take a taller building, and if it was taller, it was a couple of feet. It wasn't an additional story, which is what the incentive is here. But if you have more than 1 acre, and the McIntyre would be another one. So those are three examples of properties that are not within an overlay district that would qualify for an extra story if, in the existing code, if they have 1 acre or more of property. So that's the existing conditions. All I've attempted to do to start this conversation is suggest, and there are handouts in the back if anybody doesn't have the document that's on the screen. I did hand it out to each of the members. Nobody's reviewed this but me to date. I just did it to start the conversation. The first one relates to the sort of AC hotel condition, the density bonus for building footprints.
You didn't give us number
What?
one.
You only gave us this one page.
Yeah. Wait.
You gave us just page 2.
Oh, geez.
That's all that's here,
you see?
for the record.
Well, it's going to be on the screen. Does nobody have the?
Then you're going to have to make it much bigger so
Yeah,
we
I
can
will.
see it.
I will.
You didn't print it.
Can?
I'm going to go ask the
Yes.
city clerk to print
Could you
it.
run up and print this one then? This has all 4 pages. I don't know what happened.
You have one
Strike
copy of
2.
all 4 pages. Oops, he doesn't want to
No,
take it.
wait, Howard,
Howard,
take
you
this
want
one.
to take
I don't
this
want
and
the
just- you
I
can
don't want the
copy.
other one printed. That's the version
This is the version that
that's
has
on
all
the screen.
pages.
Okay. Well, everybody has this one, right?
No.
Oh, you have a last
we
one.
have 2.
Oh, I'm going to start with 2 then.
Start with 2.
Yeah. So you don't even have the cover.
No, we
We have
just
the cover.
We have the cover.
Page 1 is
cover and one.
You know what? I didn't do 2 to 2.
You didn't do the upside. Yeah. The backside didn't get printed.
Serves me right.
You did
Okay.
do 2 to 2.
No, they weren't single-sided. They printed two-sided.
It doesn't
And then I
matter.
did a
Let's
1 to 1.
start with 2.
Yeah, we're going to start with 2. I was trying to say paper. So, okay, we're going to start with number 2, which is the overlay districts. So you can't see that, but everybody at least has that page. I'm going
Yes.
to try and zoom in on it here.
I know, we're both looking at each other like, what's he looking at?
So right now, in that first paragraph, if you're within all the black text is in the code today, and the red text is simply what I put in there to start this conversation again. I'll keep saying that. The first paragraph there essentially says if you're within 100 feet of the North Mill Pond in the overlay district, you need to provide community space, and it has to be 20% of the lot area of your property. And All I'm suggesting we do to keep apples with each of these incentives is have the planning board, again, it's just an idea, it's not the be-all, end-all here, is that the planning board grant a conditional use permit for any of these conditions. So the planning board has jurisdiction and has two hands on the wheel, and the reason I think it's important even for the community space is because there are lots of different types of community space that somebody could propose. And unless you have the conditional use permit, it certainly makes it a little more challenging for the planning board to get the kind of community space they might feel is more optimal for the community. So it levels the playing field, if you will, between the applicant and the planning board from the existing condition, which is an as-of-right, no conditional use permit to do community space. So we kind of take what they give us. It doesn't mean we roll over. I don't think the planning board does that, but again, it's somewhat a process that's slanted in the favor of the applicant versus the planning board or the city or the larger community. So the conditional use permit, yes.
On the topic of community space, I think, and this is good to get a conversation started, but from what I've heard from criticism, and I share this critique, there's no differentiation in community space. It's basically what we're getting, what the city's getting in these projects is what can't be built on, and it's being designated as community space because it's leftover. So back to your point earlier about the fair trade concept, and this has come up in a couple of different planning board meetings. I wonder if it would make sense to have a differentiation of types of community space so that if you are so-called trading something or coming up with seeking a bonus, it's land that well, the McNabb project that you mentioned, that's buildable land.
It's all buildable land. I would argue that point in many projects.
That's different than some of these other projects that we've been seeing.
But I think there are many of those projects, and not to interrupt, but I think there are many projects like McNabb's that are not developing undeveloped, not giving us just undevelopable space. You know, every wide sidewalk.
There are exceptions, but the predominant, what I've been seeing, the predominant give of community space is not buildable. Not buildable from a building perspective. Now it's buildable from other perspectives. You could put other things there perhaps. But, and again, this is conversation. You and I haven't talked about this. And
it's a good conversation.
You know.
Lot 2 is a fully buildable lot between the parking garage and Lot 3. Fully buildable, not one constraint on it. Every wide sidewalk where the building is pushed back. Not pushed back because the developer wants to do it, but because they have to do it under the community space obligations. Those are building, that square footage is buildable, and it is cumulative, and the alleyways are all buildable. We essentially have no setbacks in any of the CD4 and CD5 districts, which is most of the downtown. You can build on the property line. You can build up to the front.
Why couldn't we change that?
What?
Why couldn't we change that?
Well, you can,
Yeah.
but we're talking about what we have and addressing perceptions versus reality. And I think that's why I did that presentation at the City Council, which I did bring here. When you start thinking about the types of community space that we have procured, a lot of it is developable land. The stuff along the North Mill Pond is what a lot of people focus on because it's in the buffer zone, you can't build there, so that's the majority of what we're getting. It's not. And, you know, we don't see some of the stuff yet because it's not finished, but the evidence is there. A lot of the community space and the majority of it is not undevelopable land, with the exception of some of the stuff along the North Mill Pond. But I would argue, when you see the level of improvements of that space, that's going to be the best community space. And it's not unimportant, to me at least, that the projects people are focusing on that they feel have no development rights, therefore the city's getting the shaft, provide probably the best benefits in the long term to the city because we have no right to set foot on that property without going through this process and getting easements to make them public spaces.
or conditional use permits. And let's not be defensive about existing conditions if we can. You know, let's have an open conversation. I think that the way to test this is to look at some actual projects that have been built and perhaps some other projects that are yet to be built and see what makes sense and what might work for a trade-off. Setback variations are one possibility, but I think it's a false premise to say it's good the way it is, which is essentially what you're saying. You're being very defensive about it because it just hasn't been built yet. There's truth to that. There's truth to
it's
that.
not what
I
I'm
understand
not-
that
yeah.
there is some of that yet to come, and I'm anxious to see it. But just the projects that we've been seeing, it's not all just buffer from the mill pond. It's other space that either actually cannot be built on or shouldn't be built on next to a railroad or something like that. So I think there's a way to improve the situation. We just have to talk about it and test it.
Do you have a couple of examples that you, like, as you're talking about, right? We heard, I think, a couple of examples where Nick feels that it has worked.
I have.
And, okay. I think it would be good to have the side-by-side comparison.
You got to
of-
look at what we've done before you can actually assess whether it's working or not, and then how to fix it. And that's what we did 2 years ago. And I am not suggesting it's at all perfect, but I am suggesting oftentimes perceptions are not reflected in the reality of what's either been approved or built or coming. That's all. And there's, that's the point I'm trying to make, and that's what happened at the city council a while ago. I'll pull this up.
Can I ask a question, Nick? I had mentioned, maybe we should zone the setbacks differently, but if you did that, would the developer would then own the setback area as opposed to the public owning it, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so
Or you buy
actually
it.
the density bonus that gives us extra community space is probably better, all worked out, than are requiring that setback, and then that could be the developer's space, you know what I'm saying? Developer
private
would own it
space
as
unless
opposed
you
to
do this, yes.
Public access.
The
like,
innovative
if you-
land use controls that Nick has referenced are very comprehensive in terms of flexibility it can give a city to enter into an actual negotiation with a developer. It's pretty much the only provision in the statutes that allow a planning board to do that. Most of the other requirements are pretty straight up. It's you conform, it's like a check mark system, or not. Workforce housing, as Beth has a lot more experience with a couple of workforce housing projects trying to negotiate with developers, and that's a process. But the same thing for community space. My point is only that it seems there ought to be a gradation of types of area on a lot that would qualify or not qualify.
If it's
And
not
perhaps
buildable, maybe you need more.
if it's not buildable at all, maybe that shouldn't qualify. If it's somewhat buildable, maybe it could qualify to a certain percentage. Right now, it's a binary system. It's it all qualifies or not. And I'm just it seems to me it hasn't been working perhaps as best it could. Now that's not saying it's not working at all. And Nick's got a lot of data to show us that, in his opinion, it's working. So I'm open to that. But I know what I've been hearing, and I realize the perception versus reality is a big thing. I'm just trying to say I think we can improve it. That's all.
I'm in full agreement with that. So let's just step back for a second, because I thought this would be useful, because, again, these perceptions exist, and it's reasonable to have them because so many of these projects have not yet been completed. So we have 13 types of community space that are listed in the ordinance, and they're shown on the screen. It is critical to understand all the property we're talking about here is private property. It's not city property. So whether it's developable or not, we have no rights to go there unless we have a vehicle to get there. And it's either buy the property and look at eminent domain or something if you want to have a public use of a private property, or you have an innovative land use statute.
Nick, can you make those a little bit bigger? And then we can kind of slide around the slide.
Go to view. View, and you can do full screen.
That worked great.
It should have.
How about I just do this?
Just do that.
Yeah, and then we can,
Well, it
as we,
doesn't seem to want to do that either. How about?
Oh, okay.
So we've got parks, greenways, sorry, it's blurry, pedestrian alleyways, wide pedestrian sidewalk, I'll just talk loud. The squares, plazas, pocket parks, playgrounds, recreational fields, Commons greens, community garden, outdoor dining cafe, and courtyard. These are used in the downtown as well as in the gateway districts out on Lafayette. So let me just give you some very quick examples. Which projects, I haven't looked at this for a year and a half. What projects have been approved for community spaces? That, loudly again. This is all deeded, it's all deeded public access, right? So it's here permanently. It'll be here 100 years from now. They can't gate this off because they don't like somebody skateboarding on the wall. This is leading from Maplewood down to the AC Hotel as a pedestrian corridor. That's just one example of part of that project. There's also a pocket park they put at the corner of the building, on the corner of Rains Ave and Maplewood. They also have
Third photo
there.
up next.
It's up there.
there. They also have a wide pedestrian sidewalk on that project, but I think I went through in detail. This is stuff along the North Mill Pond. There's the wide sidewalk on that project. This is the AC Hotel. This is all public access. Didn't have to be there. Going down to what will eventually be the Greenway connection that goes behind Rains Ave and behind 53 Green out to Market Street. So this goes all the way from, and the Sheridan was the third leg in this stool, giving us land and a pedestrian walkway from Market Street all the way around the North Mill Pond to Maplewood Ave. So these are really critical connectors. There's one between 53 Green and the AC Hotel that isn't there yet because that project isn't built. This is another connector to get you to the water. There'll also be another connector on Rains Ave to get you to the water. So the porosity or the ability, the network of trails is really important so they get used. And it's a safe place to go, and you can get to the water without starting at one end and having to go all the way to the other. This is McNabb's. These two alleyways are fantastic, and again, they were privately owned. They're still privately owned, but we have a deeded easement to keep this way in perpetuity. What are we looking at here? AC Hotel? I'm blanking. Fidelity. This is 4664 Maplewood.
yeah.
Again, I haven't looked at this for almost 2 years. Wide sidewalk. We got an arcade in this building. So the developer didn't want to do that. You can walk in most of 12 feet of the sidewalk underneath the first floor to get to the windows. That was all part of the community space for that project, as well as the connector to Bridge Street to split the block between Bridge and Deer. You can walk right in perpetuity, walk through there. Those are all developable spaces. Yeah, there are fire codes, there's some separation, but there's more width here and level of improvement that is borne by the developer, not the city. We get the easement. So I got a few more illustrations.
I think, just to touch on, I think that the illustration that you just showed of the walkway down to the AC Hotel and 3S Art Space is a great example that I don't think, and I think this is where when you talk about perception, that people think that's just public way. Well, obviously, it is public way now, but I think that, to me, is a great example in that space of a developer giving, where people don't understand that it's developer give.
Yep. Yeah, and it's perfectly reasonable to not get that. That's why you have these conversations. That's why the last city council asked me to do this presentation, to beat down some of those perceptions. These are the two projects that use the larger footprint provisions with the underground parking. That's McNabb's project at the Brick Market and the AC Hotel. So they used one of those three. I think it's the top one on the list that I gave you. Here are people that have done density bonuses, without a CUP. All these projects here, didn't use a CUP, but have community space. Again, I can make this available again. I think we just want, So the illustrations were really only on that one slide. These are the tables. And again, I did this a couple of years ago. So it isn't perfect, that's for sure. Needs to be tweaked. I totally agree with the weakness that when we have things like the North Mill Pond Greenway, we get the land from the developer, and we've negotiated in each of these projects some funding for design, but we haven't got all the construction money to build the level of improvements that we want to see happen. So then the taxpayers do bear a responsibility for building some of this space along the North Mill Pond. And I do think we can make that process more clear and maybe put more burden on the developer to carry that design forward and contribute a lot or all of the money required for the improvements that happen in that space, because that's not been well established in the code, and it's not been consistently applied over the 6 years of dealing with these respective developments along the North Mill Pond and dealing with the Greenway, partly because you need all the properties to actually do it. So a lot of it gets land banked and sits till we get the next project, because you can't, like the AC Hotel, you just go down there and you dead end. You can't yet go left or right because those projects have not yet started construction. So hopefully that at least helps identify and illuminate the fact that there is a lot of public benefit that isn't necessarily in undevelopable portions of a site. And all of these have wide sidewalks, which again are not mandatory.
It should be.
Well, yeah, okay, that there are, and you can't make them wide and then get an easement back for it without asking for it or have a conditional use permit to demand it. So many ways to skin the so-called whatever, but that's what we have today. And the attempt in what I did, hopping back to what now has been handed out, hopefully correctly.
So in terms of housing units,
Yeah.
0.
We produced 0 in these 3 areas that this applies. You know as well as others that Kim Rogers had proposed, I don't know how many units it was, 5 units in the corner where the Wells Fargo building is, which is affectionately called Lot 5, at the corner of Deer and Maplewood. But that just didn't happen for a whole host of reasons, and the new project, I think, has...
0.
No, needs 0, but, like 17 or 19 units of market-based housing over a ground floor commercial use. So, yeah, we haven't produced any. And I think we haven't produced them because the code, as adopted in 2017, did not place a priority on workforce housing being the primary benefit of these incentives. It was the Greenway and the community space. So that's the way it was adopted, that's the way it was written, that's the way it was intended, and it's largely worked to achieve its objectives. If those objectives are now changing, and we want to have workforce housing be either at parity or in priority to community space, then we need to change it. So all I've done with these 3 sections is insert some language with some boilerplate numbers as to how much workforce housing you would be obligated as a developer to provide, and make some very minor tweaks to the size of the units, because there's language in the existing ordinance that I've heard from people in the development world are disincentives to workforce housing. They're too big, the units that we require at 1,000 square feet or 800, depending on where you are. And you can get a 2-bedroom workforce housing unit easily in 600 square feet. If they want to do 800, they could, but the minimum was 800 and 1,000, I think, in the existing code, which puts the cost, it creates a disincentive for a developer to build a big workforce housing unit when the state isn't saying you need to do that, Portsmouth is. And I think we did that not out of anything other than maybe some ignorance as to how the economics work and the financial implications of whatever we put in the text play out in the market. So I've just tried to adjust, again, as a starting point, the minimum size of a workforce housing unit. You can see I used like 10% as a starting point for the conversation. I will tell you, I think you don't want to really lock in on the number, the percentage, or the depth of affordability till we have somebody far more informed than most of us in the room as to what the financial implications are of those numbers, because it's not me. I'm not able to tell you. And looking, I can tell you Market Square and Maplewood Ave are totally different markets, even though they're downtown Portsmouth, and the West End is a completely different world again, and Lafayette another. So we've either got to calibrate this to sub-districts, these numbers, or they're not going to work. If you want to make it work downtown, these numbers have to be much more modest, the demands, than they would need to be on Lafayette Road. I know that much. But I don't know what those numbers need to be.
Did you talk to the developer in Lot 5? I know we didn't ask him about the workforce housing component. What was his reaction? Just economics didn't work?
Yeah, I think that would be at 50,000 feet. The economics don't work. The unit sizes are too big. you know, and there is certainly, yeah, there's a disincentive. There's not enough of a carrot for the stick that the code actually has. And again,
That's the answer.
yeah, yeah. So we've got to adjust it.
Is it realistic to expect that anybody would build affordable housing downtown?
Workforce housing, just
Yeah,
to keep it to
workforce
something.
housing?
Yeah, I think it's realistic. I don't think it's realistic you're going to, I mean, Craig just did 64.
Right, but
But
you
yeah,
want land
is
and,
somebody in the
you know,
private
it's
sector going to do that? Yes, but I think it's difficult. You know, and when you say downtown, it's going to be really hard within an eighth of a mile of Market Square to get it. It's going to be a lot easier within the quarter mile. It's going to be way easier a mile away. So downtown is a very tough problem to solve, at least in my opinion. And I think the data suggests that's true. But we don't, you know, I think there's a place for workforce housing in the so-called downtown, as most of us, it's good to define what that is and understand the different markets within the greater downtown.
In many respects, it's the best place.
Because of public transportation.
The transportation, it's got a, you know, it's a place for employers and to have employees. It's in many respects the best place if we can do it.
Well, I don't disagree. I think what I want to make sure is that we don't perpetuate a narrative that people who fall into the financial parameters of workforce housing don't have cars, don't, you know, I think sometimes, and this is a completely different talk, but just butted in there, I think sometimes when we look at workforce housing, we think of, you know, people without cars and people that need public transportation. I know, you know, my employees make $40,000 to $50,000 a year. They have college degrees. Some of them don't mind commuting. Some of them, but they all have vehicles. They all have, you know, things like that. So I think sometimes when we're looking at where we should, and this is another topic, where we should put workforce housing and things, we often think these people don't have cars or they need access to certain things. And while those are amenities that definitely some of them need, I think there's a big chunk of people who fall into the financial, you know, area of workforce housing that still have all the amenities that, you know, normal day-to-day people in higher brackets have too.
I agree with pretty much everything you said, and I didn't mean to exclude
No,
car
of course not.
ownership. But if you don't need to use that car
It's-
every day, that's a big change
Yeah.
and big economic difference, too. So it also, you have to have places to store the vehicles, which we call parking.
Yes.
Things like that.
Never ends.
So it's, you know, we need workforce housing in other places, I was just saying.
No, yeah. I think we focus so much on workforce housing in downtown, which is needed, but we also have a huge workforce that doesn't work downtown. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That work over on Ps or directly outside of the city too. So I do think workforce housing downtown is important, but really trying to push the gateways, you know, and get workforce housing on those areas too, those commuter areas.
Yes.
So I know.
Well, I
How do
certainly
we
think
do it?
that I like the idea of making it not either or. You have to give us both.
Yeah.
That I think is
Maybe
huge.
didn't say that, but I
Yeah,
felt
that-
like that was a better place to land than
Just getting rid of
some
something.
suggestions some people have made about just dropping the community space requirements. I think that's a bad idea when we look
Well-
at what we're producing.
This is similar to what we did in the Gateway. You have to give us workforce housing if you want
If you
more
want the
density.
extra density.
But
Yeah.
is that a disincentive to the, you know, the
Builder?
public space,
It
community space?
is, but, you know,
So
it's
do we end up with no
competing
community space and no housing?
No, this says you have to give
You
us
know?
smaller amount of community space and workforce housing. That's what this change says.
And
And
it's
it's
a
also-
starting point.
it's a
That's fair
draft.
question. We need to figure out, you know, ultimately, it's a policy decision. And the policy decision needs to be informed by economic analysis, right?
Yeah.
So we're dealing with private property and developments. We need to find how much money is potentially in the wallet to go into a public benefit, and then it's up to the decision makers, the policy setters, to decide how to allocate that. And until we understand the economics, especially of workforce housing, it's really hard to come up with numbers here, in my opinion, that are going to bear out in downtown versus Maplewood Ave, which isn't outside of downtown, and the West End and Lafayette. They're just totally different real estate markets. And I would caution, based on what I've learned looking at appraisals and market conditions, that we not really start with the downtown as the problem we're trying to solve, because it's the hardest one to solve. We may not really solve it,
Right.
But that as a result of being so highly focused on where maybe the light is shining here on the downtown and the character districts, we're losing the opportunity to procure hundreds of workforce housing units not far away that still you can walk downtown, get on a bicycle, not need a car, but not need to be in Market Square or the North End to succeed in our mission here.
You said that much better than I did.
Well, I think it's a good point. We're all groping at this, but
I think we need to do both because we need to make sure that the downtown continues to shine, and it won't unless it's tended to. But another thing that ties into this, and I like your start on this, Nick, I don't mean to sound totally critical this morning because I'm just back and forth. I think another component to this would be design criteria for the community space, because quality, smaller community spaces are going to be much better, like McNabb, than just a dedication of stuff we
Greens.
couldn't pay attention
Open,
to,
yeah.
which picks up on your earlier point about who's going to improve it and how they're going to improve it. So if we had an overlay of, and we've talked about design criteria, how those community spaces actually get configured, and back into the ranking might tie into your graphic. I think that would help too. So I see possibilities here.
Could we pull back up the graphic that had the different types?
yeah, the 13.
Yeah.
So I think when we're
think
talking
it's
about
a
this,
good
it's
rank
I know we're looking at short-term solutions and stuff, how we can change this. Obviously, it's important to include the developers in this conversation. Why haven't they done this? Why haven't they? But I like having, they have to do both. It's not either or. That's why we're, because they're always going to choose the most economical choice. Obviously, the developer, that's the game they're playing. I think as far as the parking and stuff like that, like scooters, bikes, people will adapt. They'll go and buy. I mean, there was no scooters in Portsmouth, 30 years ago. Now there's hundreds of them. But I think stuff like that, people will adapt. They'll figure out a solution. If there isn't parking, they will figure out a way. The housing is the most important part of that. I know we mentioned before lowering baseline density to incentivize a building workforce housing. Is that more of a long-term change? It would go along with like having no baseline setbacks in character districts and stuff like that. Those would be more long-term changes. I'm guessing zoning changes, not.
So you're reading off notes from another conversation? Okay, yeah, that's a fair point, because I do recall bringing that up, I think, when the housing conversation, the presentation was made maybe last month, of the housing data, right? What I meant by that, at least out of my lips,
Yeah.
was I think the gateway districts, if we didn't do something not so well then when we adopted that zoning, my hunch is we allowed the baseline density to be too high, to jump the as-of-right density in the gateway went from very low to very high with no workforce housing requirement. And then we said, well, you can do even more if you want to through the innovative land use statute, and then you have to do the workforce housing at 20%, depending on rental or sale. Well, we've gotten very little product out there in the gateway, and I presented the numbers. We're talking like 800-900 units along Route 1. They aren't all built. It's the same problem as a community space. People don't actually see how much housing is in the pipeline, but most of it is market rate housing. Now, it's not a $2 million condo like downtown. It's a third of that, but it's still a lot of money. And we're not getting much workforce housing, I would say, in the gateway districts because the incentive is not great enough, and we've probably given too much away in the baseline, because we're not going to take a 4-story building and make it 6 or 7, probably. If there's an appetite for that, I haven't heard it. So the only way you're going to create an incentive for workforce housing, in my opinion, in the gateway, is to change the math or allow even more density in order to encourage the developers to do it, because they're opting out of it now 4 to 5 times, maybe 4.5 out of 5. So we're not producing workforce housing very well on the gateway either. And I think it's because we've probably, well, we've allowed a lot of density to happen in the code that we adopted, and the incentive's too small to go up, or the stick is too heavy to provide the workforce housing just for one more floor. It ends up being most of the floor is workforce, so it's a financial loser. So the only remedy is to knock down the baseline and get back up there, make the carrot work, or you got to go up higher and make the carrot bigger. So that's what I was talking about in the last meeting, about a conversation for another day. I don't think we have that problem. The irony is downtown, is the charrettes we did to generate all this zoning allowed these taller buildings, people wanted, not everybody, but this consensus was, these buildings we have now constructed were what people wanted without a conditional use permit, without, they wanted the public benefits. But we had to figure out how to get them as practitioners in taking the vision and writing the code. So all we did was take the tall buildings, make them a little shorter, and then say you can go back to what the community wants, but you got to give us this community space or workforce housing. So the irony is the buildings that are being built that people feel are too big, some people, that's what the vision actually agreed should be built. And we lowered it to get the innovative land use statute to work, to get us back to that level and have the rights to ask for these public benefits. So that's often forgotten, but it's all out there in the light of day in the vision plan. The AC Hotel was intended to be not the hotel, the property with the auto dealership or whatever, the parts, Sanel. 7 stories was what came out of the charrettes. It's only 5. They didn't use the 6th, but it was supported to do 7. And Rains Ave was all 4 and 5 story buildings. So we lowered that, and it's come back up. But anyway.
Any other, do you want to go back to part 1?
Yeah.
We did part 2 first.
Well, I didn't finish part 2. So you got it probably reading ahead while I was rambling.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to have both. Again, placeholder, mainly to get people talking and thinking, not tell you this is the right answer. I lowered the community space from 20 to 10 in the second incentive there that we had up on the screen, and then included the workforce housing option and adjusted the unit size and went to 20% and 10% depending on sale or rental. Again, starting point for a conversation. So that's what was done on the second item. Why don't I just go to the third because it's on the screen. I'll come back to number 1. So this is, again, for like a McIntyre or McNabb or the Portsmouth Housing Authority. Somebody that had an acre of land that's not in the overlay could avail themselves of this language, at least the black text that's on the page on the screen. All I've done is I did increase, this is, again, conversation, but I increased the percentage of community space here. I went the other way from 20 to 33, sort of thinking of projects like the McIntyre. That if it's going to qualify for this kind of density bonus, wouldn't it be great to get more open space than the 20% that's already in the code as the ceiling? So that's just a placeholder. Again, these are larger sites, and McNabb's site was just over 30% community space for all those alleyways. So this is consistent with, and I'll bet the Housing Authority isn't far off that when you look at all the community space that was in that project. I didn't go back and calculate it. But the main change here is to add Section B, which is an obligation to do some degree of workforce housing, either sale or rental. And again, don't get stuck on the percentage or the depth of affordability. Those are things that need to be flushed out here as we move forward. But the idea would be if you're in one of these large parcels and you want to avail yourself of a higher density project, you need a conditional use permit from the planning board, and you need to provide both of these elements. That's the idea. Could be 1%. Could be whatever people think it should be. It's a policy decision, but it should be grounded in economics.
So, since we put these bonus provisions in place, how many housing units have been created? How many workforce housing units?
None.
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 That's what I've said.
Yeah.
So even on the Gateway,
No,
The
this is
Gateway's
not Gateway.
different.
This is character districts only.
Between Gateway and downtown.
Well, the only ones downtown are the 64 units that the Housing Authority did, so that's
Right.
not to our credit, right? This didn't create it, so I'm not taking credit for that. You guys can, and thank you. But the only units we've created in the Gateway are 3 projects. One has not been built yet. We've got, I guess it's called affectionately Tex-Mex. They have 2 units in there. They were the first project way back 6 years ago.
Yep.
And then the West End Yards, I think they have 27. I could be wrong. I think it's 27. So we've got 29 out there and 64 downtown, and then there's 18 or 19 coming with the Cinemagic project. So it's like whatever that adds up to. Can't remember, 114 or something. But again, half of it's the Housing Authority.
Yeah.
In true private development, it's been very few.
Yes.
There's 20.
So it's not working
There's
well
like
anyway.
27, 8,
Is
9
it
built.
realistic
Yes,
to think that we can
it is.
require?
It's happening in Nashua right now.
No, it is realistic. And-
Nashua,
And
Exeter.
we're not Nashua either.
Well,
you know?
so the answer from my standpoint, not to monopolize the conversation, is the answer is yeah, we can. If we didn't get it at the West End Yards and we didn't get it at Cinemagic, then you could say, geez,
Yeah.
you know, we're Marblehead, it's not going to happen here. It can happen. It's just not happening well, happening frequently enough, happening in the manner in which we might want it as a community. So we got to recognize, and I'm trying to be very open here, when we wrote the code, we did it with a high degree of ignorance to the economic implications of the numbers we put in the document. And that's what we're trying to fix this go-around, is hire professionals that understand market conditions and can calibrate these numbers so we do better than what we're doing now, which is like a 10% batting average.
And as Rich said, and as we did before with the ADU, I think we need to talk to developers a little bit more
Yeah.
and just, get their perspective. which
Absolutely.
That'll be helpful.
Seems to work better in, larger projects, and
That's for sure.
obviously not right downtown where everything's so expensive. More expensive to build, everything, so.
Okay. Any
Any other discussion on that?
So that, oh, you okay?
Yeah,
Here.
no, I got it.
Here you go. Right.
Nice call. Thank you.
So, okay, so this is just, again, a starting point for a conversation, right? So let's go to number 1, then I can finish going on about this. So number 1 is the AC hotel condition, and this is what Mark McNabb used for the brick market, because he has a bigger footprint but not a taller building, and he has the parking below the building. So because he has a bigger footprint, he had to use this. That's why he has the larger community space. 30%, yeah, that's what I struck there. So I dropped it to 10. Again, not saying that is, I'm not in love with dropping it at all myself, but that's a conversation we got to have, is calibrating this. And then I added in the same boilerplate language you saw in the other sections, which is, and you got to do both. I think I said both. I should have if I didn't.
Now, do you think in ideas that was like brought up, Eric, by the ranking of them? So if we're getting a certain one, it's 30%. If we're getting a different one, it's 20%. If we're getting the options 1 through 4, it's 10%. Is that something that feels like could be worked into this code, into the code?
You mean the community space?
Yeah.
I
Like if we rank them
Maybe.
by percentage. 'Cause
I heard, I got that, and I would say maybe. I think maybe a place to start before we go to that level of menu and calibration, because it's really hard.
Yeah.
Right? This is hard no matter what you do, because it all comes down at the end of the day to dollars, right? And we don't know what those dollars are from one project to the next. We can have a good guess. When you could say to somebody, let's see your pro forma with each project, and then, decide to hire an outside consultant and say, well, there's this much to spend, let's spend this much this way. That's not likely to be the route we choose. I think what's really a gap for us now is in respect to things like the Greenway, improvements that are not fully detailed at the time of approval and the applicant is not, or they're detailed fairly well, like the back of Rains Ave, for example, what they want to do with all that waterfront area and the boardwalk. Okay, all the permits may not be in place yet. That's a question, do we make them get all the permits before we approve the project for all the amenities on the project? Maybe they did that, I just don't know. But they should be obligated to pay their fair share
Yes.
of the improvements. And we have to do that delicately, because if fair share is important, paying the full share may make it not happen, because that full share may be 10 times more than the neighbor next door that went through the same process and didn't have a waterfront to deal with, and a dock and a kayak launch and stuff that is far more expensive. So I think we need to figure out how to allocate the community space in a fairer, more equitable manner that also doesn't leave the taxpayers picking up the gap.
It's all interrelated, and as you said, it can be complicated, but we're missing information to make decisions. And I think what you've done is great to provide, some of the dials that can be turned, and we just don't know where to set those dials yet.
Right, exactly. So that may be a solution, to have percentages of this or that, but it may be just making sure everything is well detailed and who's paying for what is very clear before we approve their project.
I'd submit it's more important in an area like the downtown, where everything is much more fine-grained than it is in the outlying areas, where it may be less important. So that's another complication.
Yeah, exactly.
I would add to that, not just who pays to create it, but who pays to maintain it.
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's going to be highly variable.
Yeah.
From, a wide sidewalk, clearly, it's probably ours most of the time, so you don't have a strip of snow sitting next to our portion.
I certainly
just-
like the idea. It does say that
Yeah, you
all
have to meet them
criteria
all.
have to
Yeah,
meet.
yeah.
So, but maybe we don't have to, up till now, for the larger footprint, we've asked for 30% of community space. Maybe we split community space and workforce housing as an initial thought process. Maybe don't go down as low as 10 and 10. Now we're only asking for 20% of anything. Maybe somehow we still get the full 30.
I'm liking that, but, it's just the beginning of understanding the economics and then figuring out what those numbers need to be in the split.
Right.
We're negotiating against ourselves. We need some of that data to figure out what
Exactly.
we're doing.
Yeah.
Can I just provide just an anecdote in terms of theoretically how this stuff works, is that the more constraints there are, then the more complicated it does get for developers. One reason why you have 27 workforce housing units at West End Yards is because Torrington does this kind of stuff all up and down the East Coast. They're familiar with it. So, but for a lot of developers being not familiar with how that's going to work and how they're going to manage that and all that, I think that unfamiliarity does have an impact on it. Down at Court Street, we were getting parking relief, so the stuff in the zoning, so we were getting parking relief, which was provided if you built micro units. So micro units were units under 500 square feet. In order to get that parking relief, the hallways in Ruth Griffin Place are slightly wider than they need to be in order to take a few inches off in order to make those units smaller in order to get the parking relief. Yeah. In a 60, we have 750 square foot, 2 bedrooms. They're very, very small. But when there's always trade-offs. There's always consequences, unintended consequences with this kind of stuff.
I'd say bigger than my 2-bedroom that I had in Atlantic Heights.
Yeah.
Well, if I could just speak to what I think you're saying, because it's another important constraint to all of us doing what we're trying to do together, the development community and the local government. What I'm understanding you're saying is the relief in which you're suggesting was actually not like zoning relief. It wasn't a conditional use permit. It was actually the code allows for units up to 500 square feet to have less parking. So the baseline rights in the code and the numbers we chose to put them at were driving you to widen your hallways and reduce the size of your units because there was at least an assumption, maybe a very good one, that a conditional use permit, which our code also has, that would provide relief for a larger unit to have reduced parking, was going to be a challenge for your outfit or your application to prevail on. So I only say that because it just, it accentuates the challenges of the permitting process and the perceptions of it versus the reality, and how these boards and commissions change over time, in composition, in philosophy, in approach, in delivery. It's not an unimportant fly in the ointment for somebody on the outside looking in at any city or town, not just Portsmouth, to see how that composition and changing philosophy as to how they even use the ordinances they have affect these design decisions. So you've got unleasable space in the hallway that's not in the unit because a choice was made not to seek any type of relief under a conditional use permit, not a variance, to have reduced parking demands for a 550 square foot unit. So I appreciate you bringing that to the table.
Right, and along the same lines, you require a workforce housing unit to be over 600 square feet, but then also have an incentive to have parking relief for things under 500 square feet. So it ends up all, just complexity.
Compounds the problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And that innovative land use controls, where conditional use permits arise in the statute, they can be very open-ended for negotiation, but they can also be very limited. They can be more like a special exception. They can provide, if these criteria are met, the conditional use permit shall be granted. It can be that simple, too, which could remove some of that opacity that you saw. I'm wondering, could we even get that? Your team could look at it and go, yeah, well, we can do this, 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 and this, so we qualify. So that could be something to look at.
That's an excellent point.
Anything else on this? Anything else, Nick?
I don't think so.
So we can move on, and I believe Howard can help us walk through the next item on our agenda, which is our next steps in taking the longer look of incentives across our entire city, instead of focusing just on the character districts, where we have a difference between character districts and Gateway, which we've gone into a lot. We wanted to talk about the scope of work, the timeline, and the budget for doing all of this.
Well, Nick touched upon it in his presentation. We're currently, I would say, in process or starting negotiations with retaining a consultant to help us understand what the market analysis is, and to reiterate, it's not only in the overlay district, but in other areas around town. We need to have a deep dive on these sub-market areas to understand how the workforce housing can be better understood and brought to bear. The timeline for that is we're looking to get this started later in the summer in order to really start making an effort on advancing the ADU. The budget number, it's all going to be paid through my position's paid through one grant. We have a different grant to hire third-party consultants, and that's where the money is going to be coming from.
How much money?
The grant was $82,000.
The grant was $82,000. We're looking
Just
to,
for the consultant, or?
Yes, just for the
Again,
consultant.
not just one either. We've
Right,
got a
so-
number of subtasks. but-
we've got an
One's for
82.
economic, one's for writing the actual draft. Yeah.
Right. The $82,000 is allocated to allow us to hire third-party consultants, and as was said, just not one. It could be three. It could be four.
Yeah, whatever, right,
We're-
whatever
we're-
works.
We're,
Right.
we're looking to get multi-use out of this data, and so it's not only for understanding the market sector for workforce housing, but understanding the other implications for other housing types around the city as well. We're looking to be able to use this information to inform a little bit more about what's going to be happening with the ADU handbook. We're also looking to get some understanding out of this to help forward what's coming up with the renewal of the master plan. So this data is just not going to be specific or used for the purpose of workforce housing, but I think it's going to have a broad spectrum of application.
And when do you think we'll actually be in line for a consultant to come on board and start that work?
Well, we're already starting to engage the consultant. We just need to finalize the scope agreement, and we need to coordinate with Invest New Hampshire to understand where this contract is and where we're going to get started. So we know it's sooner than later.
60
I'm being
to 90
conservative.
days, I think, is realistic.
Everything moves so slowly.
Well, we don't want it to move slow, but there's a certain hierarchy that we need to flow through that's outside of the city for this.
Just a suggestion on that is, yeah, it does move slow, but I think something we could develop as part of this committee and conversation that would be really helpful to whoever we hire is to do a similar conversation maybe at the next land use committee meeting about the gateway zoning. Let's have a primer 101 on the gateway zoning and show some examples so we can understand better, all of us, including, it helps me tremendously to prepare for these things, to understand what is actually happening on the field versus the code and identify where we think some of the problems lie. So when we have that consultant on board, we're informed as to where we're at and where we're headed if we don't do anything. So I think we can
That's a
get a
good
lot
idea.
done.
So what kind of information will we be getting from the consultant in terms of housing stock? Is it, like, what are the details that we can expect?
Bob, just make sure you talk into your microphone. Talk into your
want me to
microphone,
take a stab
because
at
there
that?
are people that
Sorry.
are online that need to hear.
Yeah.
So Nashua, RKG did a study in Nashua for the city of Nashua, a financial analysis of their submarkets in order to draft, in their case, a workforce housing ordinance that is presumably going to generate workforce housing, and it's based on market conditions and a market analysis to do what probably I think we're going to need here, to break down Market Square from a quarter mile out, from an half mile out, a mile out, Lafayette.
Will it be, what is it, just rental figures, sales figures,
Gonna be
number
looking-
of units?
No, it'll probably be looking primarily at all the financial implications, regardless of the density of the project, what it costs to buy property there, what it sells for, what the economics look like in comparison to these submarkets, so we can calibrate these numbers that are in the code and not ask for too little because we focus on downtown, which downtown is going to be the hardest market to crack for workforce housing, but not bring the numbers from Lafayette and try and make them work downtown, because they won't. So it's really about understanding the economics from a real estate perspective.
Okay.
And probably do some case studies. They'll probably be able to look at some properties under this contract, and that's probably how they're going to have to generate the submarkets, is to do some scenarios. That's my guess.
Okay.
If anyone is interested, I can send over this link. I've been following along with that process and some other municipalities just going through it. And it's all, the state has put together a pretty good document on inclusionary housing, including model ordinances and kind of examples that have happened in other communities. And it's really nice because it touches on the different RSAs and somewhat the wiggle room that, people and communities have found based for inclusionary housing.
Yep.
So if anyone on this committee wants it, I can send out that link. It's pretty good.
And I would argue at the end of the day, if we get the incentives right, this is in some ways an easier market to do workforce housing if we actually understand the math, because everybody wants to be here. The demand it's got to be the highest demanding city or town in New Hampshire. So we know demand is high, but it's got its constraints of values. But if we get the numbers right, we should be able to succeed on this, and not everywhere at the same rate. But we're all smart enough to know that. Market Square is a tough place to put workforce housing. But go 4 or 5 blocks away, it starts to become possible if you get your numbers right. And if you go a mile away, where you can still get on a bus, still ride your bike, it's much easier, because people still want to live here and work here.
Have you had a chance to start the handbook, Howard?
We don't have the law passed yet.
Well, we've started it.
Oh, it's going to get passed.
Yeah.
So to really get the handbook going, it's needing to see what exactly it's referring back to. So once that is passed, that's going to go moving ahead very quickly. Speaking about the grant money, we're looking into engaging some consultants to help graphically represent what in the ADU handbook, because we want to make sure that people can visually see, and there's a commonality to that. I also want to go back to a couple points that were made in the earlier conversation. One thing that you had mentioned is the workforce housing. Not all these people are people without cars and relying on transit. While we're waiting to engage this person on the deep economics, one of my roles and efforts over the next few months is going to be reaching out and communicating with some of these user groups so we can not only understand what the numbers are in the regulations, but speaking about unit sizes and things like that, what these people that would be occupying this workforce housing, who they are, what they're looking for, and what their needs are, because I believe that will inform some of the regulatory changes as well. So it's just not waiting for the market analysis to be done. While we work, that will be working as well.
No, I think that's a really good point, Howard. I think it's good to ask those people and not have us guess.
Right.
I hate guessing.
No. Never. Whenever anyone comes with a Fairlane, I guess what you want, I get it wrong.
All right. Does anybody have anything else to add on either of the agenda items that we've been talking about? Because I know we've been going on for a while now.
Have we thought of incentives for existing housing stock? For instance, if somebody owns an 8-unit apartment building and, they're maybe charging reasonable rents, but if they sell it, then someone turns it into condos or jacks their rents way up. Is there an incentive for someone like that to turn that housing stock into workforce housing? Whether it be sort of like, 79E that holds the taxes for 5 years or whatever.
So it's a good question. I don't think it's a zoning remedy.
Yeah.
That would, so there is an answer to that, and the answer is yes, but it, in my opinion, is a non-regulatory answer, not a regulatory answer. If you're looking to, if one is looking to buy deed riders or regulatory agreements that make things workforce housing, that might act like workforce housing but aren't deed restricted as workforce housing, so they result in what you've just said. They get purchased and converted to condominiums, or the buyer just wants to have market-based rents. And the only way, the most effective way to deal with that is to have something like an affordable housing trust that would be could be fed funding through regulatory requirements and general obligations, from the tax base.
Which we have
Any
the
number
trust
of
and
sources,
it's
grant money, but many communities in Massachusetts that have inclusionary zoning, have affordable housing trusts, and do require, most communities require all developments over 3 units in size, regardless of the type of housing, to pay their fair share into the Affordable Housing Trust, because small projects cannot usually amortize a workforce housing unit. If you're under 10 units, it's too big of a subsidy. But they don't get off without having to provide their fair share. So it's just a sliding scale. It's amortized. If it's a $500,000 subsidy to build a workforce housing unit at 10 units, if you do 5, you're going to put 250, for example, into the Affordable Housing Trust. Just as that's a big number, and most communities are not up that high. But that's a way to feed the trust. The trust then can go out and help with first-time home buyer, down payment assistance, buy deed restrictions, the whole host of things they can do from a programmatic side using funding from a variety of sources, including the code. But,
Which
so.
I believe former counselor, current state rep Rebecca Perkins-Coca had really pushed that initiative when we set the affordable housing policy, which said, be more lenient on certain things and kind of navigate that system, and then, talking about the housing trust. But I think it's important for people at home to know that we do have a housing trust that is empty. So we do have ability and to look at potentially in our code mandating something like that, I think.
Yeah, I think what you kind of talked about is an idea of what 79E talks about, which is rehabilitation of a certain building or a certain size, and being able to, for a certain number of years, the city would not be able to property tax them on a value any higher than it was when they bought the building, for them then in exchange giving us some workforce housing units for a period of time. And that, I think, is something I've looked at it a lot. The hard part is finding the area, because that's basically making it a zone, right? So you would dictate
Yeah.
a zone of
Right,
your
it's
area.
not- 79E probably isn't the mechanism.
But something in an idea of that is what I think you're
Yeah.
talking about. And that is a policy decision that would be basically a program that we would have to assign, and we just need to make sure we have the state legislation to actually do that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because when I read the RKG report that was put together for the needs assessment of Portsmouth, I never realized, because this isn't something, it's often a priority for us, given all the things, all the competing objectives we have in the planning department, but I didn't realize how many subsidized housing units are in the city that the housing authority does not have care and custody over, that have these deed riders or regulatory agreements in place that have they've either expired, and who knows what the hell's going on in those units, or they're about to expire. And we could spend the next 10 years of our lives trying to create 400 units of workforce housing in 10 years, and we'd be patting ourselves on the back.
We've
One of these
lost.
projects expires, and there goes 400 units.
Yeah.
So I think of the Ledgewood Drive,
Yeah.
I've been up there, and it's clearly workforce housing, but it's not deed restricted, I think, anymore, but I don't know. The fact that I don't know is embarrassing. I learned it by reading that report, what's out there, and we can't lose sight of not only the stuff that's below market that could be market, but the stuff that's below market that has been mandatorily below market, that's fallen out of the restriction,
Right.
or about to fall out, and we're gonna lose a tremendous amount of workforce housing in the next 5 to 10 years if we're not paying attention. And most cities and towns, from my experience, are not paying attention to that stuff. So it just disappears, or it happens too late and you don't have time to act, because we don't move that fast to be able to get an appropriation and bring the technicians on board. That's my experience, and I think that was a real warning sign to me, reading that report, is that we're at real risk of losing lots of workforce housing.
Yeah, so if we had an incentive for those owners to remain affordable.
Yeah, and I think
workforce.
Craig will tell you that incentive needs to be huge, because the financial incentive, what probably keeps many of them from not kicking everybody out is the fact they got to kick everybody out. And it's not a fun process, but
Right.
the wrong guy or gal comes along to buy it, and everybody's out, and the thing is twice as expensive the next day, and they haven't done anything but sweep it out.
Right.
So, anyway, that's
Well, I
a
think
little hyperbole, but I think it's right under our noses, and we can't forget to talk about that.
It took us 6 years and $15 million to build 64 workforce housing units. And then the Rockland Street Apartments, the 48 Rockland Street Apartments, was one of these expiring use properties. The Section 8, 20-year Section 8 contract ended, and they sold the property. And so we lost 48 units in a matter of 60 days. So we're definitely going backwards. And the housing needs assessment that we commissioned last year, as you know, the number that we need between now and the end of this decade, that Portsmouth can support another 1,500 affordable units. That's because we've underbuilt for decades. So naturally, what we're looking to do, and other folks I hope are looking to do, is do projects with some kind of economy of scale. 1,500 is, we've been doing this for 60-something years, and we've, built 668 apartments. If we continue on this 10 a year thing, relative to that 1,500 number, we'll produce 70 more units. So, and this kind of stuff. And that's with over 80% of the workforce in Portsmouth qualifying for the kind of affordable units that we build. And I hear from people and employers every single week, people want to get into Ruth Griffin Place and need to, and are desperate for that housing. And our wait list is 280 long. So we're way behind and going, getting behind faster.
All right, with that depressing note, if we're all set on our end, I will invite anyone from the public that may want to come forward and speak. Name and address for the record.
Peter Huda, 280 South Street. Just a couple comments on the discussion that you were having today. The first one on the density bonus for building footprint. One thing that you might consider here is, especially for the parking, it depends on where the parking is going to be available. Especially downtown, the parking that was discussed on the McNagg building, that is parking for only what is in the building. It's not public parking. So I think a larger consideration might be put on somebody providing public parking also, when you consider that. The other thing I like to remind you of is when you're considering all of these conditional use permits, and this is what you do for a lot of the stuff that we've been working so hard on. There's a number 10247 repetitive application in the code. And it says, if the application for a conditional use permit is denied by the planning board or other such board or a person may have jurisdiction, no application for a conditional use permit for the same or similar use may be made within 1 year. It also says, in such an event, the resubmitted application shall follow the same procedures as the original. So we're working really hard to put these all in place, but are we actually following the code that's actually in place for putting these in? And we've had a perfect example at least 2 or 3 times come back before the boards on this. They come to the boards, they go through all our boards, they get okayed, and then nothing happens. Then they come back with a different situation, and we have this again. This is how we lost the workforce housing 20% at West End Yards. And we have the same situation that is happening at 2554 Lafayette. So I would urge you to also enforce everything that we have currently on the books when you're considering all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi there, Liza Hewitt, 726 Middle Road. In the discussion about the community space, I think you are aware, but you need to continue to be aware of the perception by many residents, who are become a little discouraged about the size of these buildings and the fact that the alleyway between the 2 buildings was community space. I think the perception of community space and what is actually being given as community space are 2 different things, and I don't know how you can kind of align that better, but I think that that's where some of the challenge comes in. And along with that, the question of who's using this community space. I understand that 12-foot sidewalks can be great and they can allow a bicycle, but I don't think you can ride your bike on the sidewalks downtown, so 12-foot spaces in front of 3 art space. While I can try to understand like Nick's planning background perspective on that, as a resident, what does that do for me? I mean, I think of community space, I'm going to take my kids and have a picnic somewhere. We're going to go to the park and walk the dog. And that's not what these spaces are, and that's not what is being granted. So I think that's where, you get community members that are frustrated by this incentive. And then as far as the gateway goes, I guess I'm curious as to how much land is left in the gateway. We're now talking about, incentives for workforce housing, which I am all for. And, maybe focusing in the gateway, but how much land is really left in the gateway? Because as I drive down Lafayette, which I do almost every day, there's a 3-acre parcel at the end of Constitution with a big sign on it. That's all I see. I mean, you've got a lot of housing along Lafayette. And when I look at, for instance, West End Yards, community space for their dog park, which is a chain-linked fence, dog run, who is using that? I mean, the developers should be giving that community space of themselves, not contingent upon anything else, because they want people to move there and run their dogs in this chain link fence. To me, that's not a dog park, and it's not being used by any residents other than the ones that are living there. So Corey Clark brought this up a couple of meetings ago, and I think it's true. I think you need to look at the difference between community space in the gateway and what that means, and community space downtown. And I'm not so sure that in the gateway, for whatever little property there is left that may potentially be developed, I don't think that that should be an option at all for community space. You know, the pickleball courts at Cinemagic. How many people from like the South End are going to be driving over to Cinemagic to use their pickleball courts? They're not. So is that community space for the community, or is that community space for the residents that are living within that development? And if it's the community space for the residents living in that development, then I think the developer should provide that. It should not be incentivized by the city. So that's it. I would be, though, interested in if anybody knows how much land is left in the gateway before you spend all this time talking about trying to bring more workforce housing to the gateway. If there's no land, you're kind of wasting your breath. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Just me. Hey. Megan Corsetti, Colonial Drive, Portsmouth. Thanks so much for the presentation. I did enjoy it, learning a lot, trying to learn a lot. I think that it's great that you're dissecting this, that you're going to be bringing on a firm to look at what the options are. I do want to commend the group for that. I guess just some thoughts that I've had, if it matters. Have we looked at any sort of incentives with some of our like plazas, Plaza 800, Market Basket? I mean, these are flat buildings that could we potentially do something to beautify them and add housing above there? I know at the last land use meeting, there was talk about looking at parking lots and how we can make those into potential housing options. So I just hope that you guys continue to kind of leave no stone unturned. We have to think outside of the box, I think, in Portsmouth, because there is not a lot left. And that was really evident in the last land use committee meeting. So I just wanted to offer that. I like to solve problems. It's what I do. So I just wanted to offer some thoughts that I had. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Is there anyone online that might want to? I know we had at least one person.
Nope. I'm getting there. Get this out of here.
Oh, we don't have anyone anymore.
Okay.
It's just, yeah.
Can
All
I-
right.
Can I just say a
Yeah.
couple things?
Sure.
Because there's some very good questions asked. Just as a general answer to the question regarding the quantity, I would guess we have hundreds of acres in the gateway because 80 to 85% of it is redevelopment. It's not greenfields we're looking for here. It's the plazas. It's Southgate doing Cinemagic. It's the iHeart Radio. It's the mall next to it with these, ocean-sized parking lots. Those are all the gateway. So there's a huge opportunity here to rebuild those neighborhoods, connect them, and make them vibrant, make them self-sustaining, so everything isn't just downtown Portsmouth as a reason to live here. I look at the transformation in the 12 years I've been here of the West End, and it's phenomenal. Just the West End. It has it always had a distinct identity, but I think it's better than it was 12 years ago. And it's a thriving place that's going to continue to get better. It also happened to be, when I got here, probably the most paved and impervious neighborhood in the entire city. And it's still largely that way. But redeveloping, I mean, this city has, like many cities in America, a sea of asphalt covering the earth. And those are our opportunities, just like the Sheridan lot, just like the North End, just like Port Walk, all of those properties that were a sea of parking that most people, other than wanting to park their cars, would not see as an asset where they're taking photographs for their grandmother in Europe, when they visit. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to do the kinds of things everybody's talking about and making Portsmouth better. And I do think, I think the process generally works. Could it be better? Yes. But I think the triage that's required at the planning board to determine how to allocate who the beneficiaries are of any particular community space, you have to trust your volunteers on these boards to decide whether the wide public sidewalk, the alleyways that I will argue will be fantastic when that greenway is built to get between these buildings and get to those great spaces that none of us have been able to get to in our lifetimes unless we trespass. The planning board needs to decide and figure out whether this community space is a greenway that's of general benefit, neighborhood benefit, or just a sub-neighborhood and maybe even the development itself. And I think there's still benefit to the public even if something is not going to be used frequently by most of us. It is there. You might end up in that neighborhood someday, and it will be there for you to use, and that development cannot kick you off those pickleball courts if you choose to drive there. And that's actually the greatest example of where people will drive a long distance to play pickleball on someone else's court. But your point is well taken, but I think the planning board has to maintain flexibility, but I leave it.
And one of the things to add to that, especially on those pickleball courts, is that we required them to put signage to make sure that the public knew that those were open to the public and that they're not just for the community, like some people might think. Because some people do visit that plaza all the time, and if they see them and see the sign, there might be more actual public trying to use those. So that was one of the
And they're
reasons.
lit.
Traffic concern we have to take into consideration. I get it.
As someone who lives on Route 1, it's a fun time in the summer, water country. But I think it's a great point that you make about not everything is going to be a benefit to everyone, but it is a benefit to some neighborhoods, and bringing it back down to the planning board to really, dictate how that works.
Right.
The rail trail's a great asset, but if you live over in the South End, the likelihood that you're driving all the way over there to park and get on the rail trail. But for people in my right, in the Gateway and the Route 1 side, it's an amazing asset that
Right.
we all use.
And a lot of people love outdoor dining, and it doesn't occur on a narrow sidewalk. So there's a lot of pieces here, and they're not all permanent, and they're not all used by everyone. And it's not perfect, but I do think we need to keep really open as to how the planning board applies that.
Well, I do think it would be great for us to take a dive into, again, looking at the gateway incentives at our next meeting. I think that the more knowledge we have about what's existing now and what's possible, that when we do get the data, I think it'll be easier to make those informed decisions. So, thank you, everyone, for your involvement, and we will keep trying to move this forward, and see you next time. Thank you.